Hello everyone, and welcome to my first ever video podcast. My name is James and I want to produce a little mini-series looking at the subject of architecture. I feel inspired to do this after watching a series of video blogs produced by Sean Carroll of Caltech University during the lockdown. He called his series The Biggest Ideas in the Universe and tried to take the vast subject of cosmology and fundamental physics and break it down into little bite-sized pieces to make it comprehensible to people who are interested, but not necessarily physicists. Make it available to the public. I thought it was a great idea, and I'd like to do something similar with architecture. So you might ask me, well, what qualifies me to speak about architecture? And the first answer to that may be nothing at all. I'm not an architect. But another answer to that may be the fact that my father was. He trained in architecture in the 1960s, between 1963 and 1970, and here he is, or his certificate. He was given elected member of the RIBA in 1973, and I was born 1977, and so I feel I've grown up with the ideas of architecture. I've grown up understanding that mindset and viewing the world through that lens, and I think it has value, I think it has importance, I think it's poorly understood and heavily underutilised, and I think a lot more could be done to promote architecture, and I wish people would. I wish it was better understood. The fact that it's not well understood seems to reflect itself in a series of government reviews and industry reviews that have continued throughout the 20th century and continue today. This begins with the introduction of the Architects Act in 1931, which came at a time when town planning was being considered important, and a division in the idea of trying to create the character of town and separate it from the character of countryside, and trying to understand what the character of each was. At that point, architecture started to become scrutinised a lot more. Following the war, the two world wars in the 1910s and the 1940s, you then move into the 1950s and there's a period of reconstruction and architecture comes under the spotlight once again. So by the 1960s, interest is again focused on how to maintain the character of our towns, and a series of publications were produced then. Also at that time, architecture, it was felt, was under threat from builders and developers just coming along and simply building things, which meant a lot of heritage was torn down as well, and conservation and preservation became big subjects in the 1960s too. That would be the period that my father trained in architecture, and we then moved into the 1970s, and the economics of architecture started to get questioned, and people started to produce lots of publications and professional articles about the relevance of architecture and whether we need it, whether it has a purpose, whether its day has been and gone and it's lost its way. And so I've got a collection of literature here beginning 1974. We have a book, Crisis in Architecture, producing a series of articles debating the subject. This continues. 1981, the RIBA journal produced a special edition, The Frustrated Generation, looking at the generation of architects that trained in the 1970s and felt that the relevance of their subject had been lost. It's also reflected in Architectural Knowledge by Frank Duffy, who collected together a series of articles he had produced over his lifetime and pieced them together into one volume, published in 1998, to see if that gave an overall narrative of the subject. It does. It's very good. It needs a little analysis to make it a bit more digestible, but it's there. And all of this led into the 1990s, when there were further reviews looking at architecture and whether it needed to change again. And at that point, the contractor and the constructor having much more of an influence than the architect himself. And so it's felt that perhaps the way architects are educated might need to change. And so we started seeing more publications, Changing Architectural Education, a large book, lots and lots of essays looking at how to break the subject down to assist universities in educating on the subject. That was published in 2000. It continued for the next 20 years and is still debated now. So 2017, a former RIBA president, Jane Duncan, edited another volume trying to characterise the field of architecture, trying to get to the essence of what it is to do architecture and to be an architect. And that's been carried on ever since, with the recent RIBA president, Alan Jones, working with Rob Hyde, producing Defining Contemporary Professionalism, another very large book, lots and lots of essays, all published through here, but collected together in a big Venn chart, looking, each one of those indicated subjects refers to an essay in the book, and they've been divided into 4 spheres of influence: business and practice, education and research, technology and innovation, rules and regulations, to see if there's a way of canvassing for an overall impression of the profession, to see if we can characterise it even more and find out what is relevant. Personally, I think this volume of texts and all the articles in the professional journals is just confusing. I think it's too much. I think it's too complicated. I think it doesn't clarify the issue at all. I think it can be made a lot simpler. So just as Sean Carroll with his science podcasts raises the question, well, what's happening with fundamental physics? Why, in his field, do they use fundamental physics? Do they use quantum mechanics? But they've chosen not to try and understand it. They say it works, that's enough. That's all we want to do. And they don't want to understand it. And his sense is that that's an embarrassment. My sense, looking at publications such as this, there's a similar embarrassment in architecture. It needs not just a definition to be discussed endlessly, but it actually needs pinned down a little bit. There's a sense in architecture that is a creative profession, so it can be anything you want it to be. I'm not entirely sure that's super helpful. I think there is an underlying simplicity to it, which I think exists, and as I've grown up with it, I've grown up with the ideas of architecture all around. I see the world in that way, and so if I've explored subjects of ecology or archaeology myself, I see that they reach limitations that architecture could help them overcome. And so I wish the subject were better understood. I wish it were better engaged. I wish it was utilised by more people. And so for that reason, I've been delving into the subject, and I want to now break it down and present a few simplified concepts and see if that makes it more digestible. And so I hope this works. And so I hope you'll follow me on this journey, and we'll see where we end up. So thank you. Thank you for listening, and thank you for coming with me.